With a group like this that is as well read as everyone here, I don't think there's anything that we can tell you that you haven't heard about the situation in and of itself. Just that one of the realizations we've had after talking to probably about 10 companies over the past week in our portfolio, some of the more experienced board members on those boards, and it's just become crystal clear how unique this current situation is. I try not to miss an opportunity to do a Venn diagram, and from the economic crises which we've seen with economic indicators and quickly rising unemployment and stock market to systemic risk of a little bit of what we saw in 2008 with liquidity issues, and then just the impact on daily life is probably the most challenging to many of our portfolio companies because they're typically isolated from some of these cyclical events simply because when they're funded for 18 months, their early revenue, they're just not impacted by the types of larger economic issues. So I think it helps when thinking about how we engage or how we engage our portfolio companies, just to think about their experience set. So everyone, I'm sure, has been looking at their 401ks and these kinds of charts. And I just share this again, that it really is impacting everyone related to the investor community, our portfolio companies, their employees. So if there's an upside to this, it's that everyone has permission to have these kinds of conversations. Everyone is expecting to be having hard conversations, and most people in the entrepreneurial community expect that charts like this turn into the next chart, which is just the latest Crunchbase estimate of how seed stage funding is likely to fall this quarter. It's also worth indicating that 22% projected loss is primarily driven by a lack of activity over the past 4 weeks. So it's disproportionately, I think this is a leading indicator of what's to come. But for seed stage specifically, which is earlier, riskier, I think we can expect there to be a retrenchment as far as where institutional venture capital funds and individuals get involved. So as part of our planning process, I think we need to take that into account, much like we saw in 2008. So it's important for us, obviously, to react quickly, to react clearly, but not to overreact or do some of the wrong things. And talking to some portfolio companies, sometimes the instinct is to do some of these wrong things, either by following others' behavior, following a playbook from a different time. So part of the goal here is just to create some structure around how we've been thinking about this. So on the next slide, we looked at this in terms of 3 phases of how we would engage with our portfolio companies. And the first is simply around safety and employee support. This really went out the window last week when the governor stepped in and I think made clear what Ohio-based businesses and citizens need to be doing. The business continuity aspect is something where we've been able to share best practices, where we've been able to get some focus on some of the CEOs that are doing this well. And we've seen some really nice examples of how our companies are handling customer service, how they're showing their clients that they're there, they're engaged, and being closer to the needs of the people that pay them and keep the lights on. Then the last piece here is probably the most important, just the planning and then the action steps that need to be taken in order to weather the storm. So on the next slide of what this means for our startups, I think there's more good than bad here because our startup companies tend to be smaller and more nimble. They tend to be in a single office, not across multiple locations. They tend to have a strong unifying culture. So they really can be more nimble and can take things like this in stride. They also tend to be more remote. They're certainly less anchored to place because products are not built in a physical place. They're built in a cloud infrastructure, which is typically hosted by Amazon or Microsoft or some other external cloud. And even the secondary tools and support like CRM and marketing automation, being in a cloud-based realm, there really is the ability to not miss a beat on remote work. So a lot of the product development can and will continue here virtually uninterrupted. The software as a service revenues can be protective. So for many of our companies where they have millions of dollars of contractual revenue and a product is out there being used, that revenue is probably only at moderate risk simply because there are contracts in place. A lot of these large companies, as long as it's an important service, are going to focus on the bigger picture things, not throwing out every piece of the kitchen sink. So far, that looks and feels pretty good. And then there are also lots of opportunities for disruption to present opportunities. Lauren mentioned one of them earlier with Wiser, where they and some other companies have found that their product is really more valuable in today's environment because it provides relief from some of the pain points of the current situation. You know, the bad news is that employees are impacted. There's a lot of psychological attention that has to be in play, really deployed to teams that CEOs are dealing with for the first time. When our teams aren't hearing back from their customers, it's hard to know if it's because they've got other priorities, because they don't have communication systems outside their offices, or if some of those people are sick themselves, and that's provided some stress for our companies. Then lastly, investors are impacted because even individuals, right? We pay attention to the stock market, liquidity is impacted. So our startups are going to have to work in this new environment. On the next slide, more situation specific. We recently did surveys at the end of the year just to check on how much cash, what the burn levels are, how many employees. So we have companies with anywhere from effectively zero in the bank to $20 million in the bank. The more cash, the better off they are. Obviously, the lower the burn rate or the more they can adjust their burn, the better. These products that are essentially painkillers, right, or address a meaningful problem, those companies are more likely to survive these times. And on the risk side, obviously, less cash, higher burn, and the lower percentage of recurring revenue that you have as a company, the riskier it is. So we're in the process of taking the data that we have from the last financials we have with these companies, applying these subjective categories and trying to better define who is at risk and where we should be engaging. Clearly, some of the weak will be culled out by this. Companies that were going to fail anyway will probably fail more quickly. But our goal is to ensure that all companies that have a great market opportunity today can best put themselves in a position to be successful and weather the storm. Going to the next slide, this is some of the counsel we've put together for portfolio companies and we would share with our boards of directors. As simple as it is, not running out of money is a very big deal. It starts in a couple ways. One is raising money wherever they can. So one of our companies finished a round last week. Any companies that have an open round that's not fully syndicated yet, we're encouraging them to raise, to bring in any capital that they can. Jobs Ohio is still open for business on their loan programs. We've seen some relief coming from Jobs Ohio already for Amplifund, the former Streamlink. We've seen that they have agreed already to, I believe it's a 6-month pause on payments. Other banks, institutions are responding to this. So we would encourage all our companies to ask for relief wherever possible, and then to right size to the new normal. Actually, one thing before right sizing to the new normal, as far as relief goes, many of you have probably read about SBA and other federal programs. Well, there's currently a relief program, which has been out for a while, which is available to many companies, disaster loan program. But what's more interesting before is what is being developed for the SBA lending banks would approve a loan for payroll, rent payments, and other debt starting March 1st and possibly forgive 4 months of that. So that's a meaningful 7-figure amount for many of our portfolio companies. So we're encouraging all of them to register through the SBA portal, to work with their service providers. And on this call on Friday, we're hopeful we can provide them with some more substantive advice. On the right sizing to the new normal, everyone we think should be freezing hiring and new expenditures right now. Take a breath, better understand what environment we're coming into here over the coming weeks. Consider a shared plan. Several of our companies have already defined plans to either reduce salary, with the biggest hits coming from founders and those at the top, some salary reductions, some salary deferments, some conversations of putting options in place as a way to signal to employees that this is a continuing commitment and we want people to be involved, but a way of acknowledging that there's going to be less cash than is in any of the board approved plans just as of a couple months ago. And considering headcount reductions where there are opportunities. As far as the planning, we're trying to encourage people to understand how much of their current revenue is at risk. For SaaS companies, it's basically looking at two things. What is your contracted MRR and ARR, and how much of that is really at risk? Churn, we would expect, would be higher in this situation, but SaaS churn is usually relatively low. We would hope it would stay relatively low. The biggest area of risk is probably new sales. Some of the pipelines are frozen solid right now. Others are still moving. But for companies that have a budget based on a certain amount of new revenue this year, we're strongly advising that they revisit that and plan accordingly. That's the downside. The upside, though, is that we want our companies to play offense, to try to better understand what customers need now more than ever, understand for which specific segments and types of customers we might have more value. And that's exactly what Wiser is doing. So we're hopeful that a lot of companies will come to that type of realization. Then the last topic on this slide here is just over communicate. It's natural for a lot of people to just focus on the problem, to not want to talk about this, to assume everyone has enough information. But we're encouraging everyone to talk to their board, ideally weekly, be candid, ask them what they can do to support the company, to be in more communication with their employees, to have all hands meetings, to have happy hours in the evenings, to try to create a sense of community so that employees know that the teams are there doing everything they can to be successful. And then, lastly, and this is a little bit of a acknowledgement to Dan Rose and the EOS process that he's put us through, is just to make sure that companies don't forget their core values in the process here, right? That these values are in mind when decisions are being made and in plain sight when decisions are being communicated to the team, because the team and the clients, we think, really will remember that. And with that, I'll pass it back to Daniel, and we'll talk a little bit about the survey that we sent out to our portfolio companies.
Sure. So just as a recap, we sent this survey last Thursday. So, likely there's been progress since that survey happened with a number of these companies. We received 23 responses, expect to receive others as well. And I'll just walk through very quickly a few highlights. We found it to be very insightful. Before I dive into this one, I've organized most of this feedback in line with the three buckets that Todd just mentioned, or the key areas where we're suggesting, some best practices. You'll see that some of the feedback, we characterize as very encouraging. It appears our companies are taking the right actions. Some of the feedback suggests that there's areas where clearly need extra attention. And we will share even more than these highlights, kind of nearly full detail with you as a follow-up here to this meeting. But to start with, communication. So next slide. Related to communication, we're seeing all companies nearly moving to full remote situation, working via video conference. There's only a handful that have had a need for people to be in the office. And this is probably not news to you, the combination of different platforms that they're using. Slack does stand out as one. Many companies are using Slack and Slack channels in this new normal to create forums, drive engagement, employee connection, and that connectivity at this time. But a mix of weekly stand-up meetings, of kind of finding a new cadence with key team members, investors, and staff. It is encouraging as well to see such a large percentage who have already reached out and proactively communicated with their board within the last 2 weeks, just regarding the potential impacts on the business. So next slide. This quote, I think, just also summarizes a nice best practice from one of our top performing portfolio companies at OnShift. So I'll give everyone a chance to read and digest that, but basically in the spirit of over communicating, capturing some of the importance of that, and the approach that Mark is taking, which I think is wise advice for all of our portfolio companies at this point. Next slide. Just as far as leadership and planning is concerned, you know, all of our CEOs, as you might imagine, are seeing their roles be impacted here, how they execute, how they need to play the center and stability for these companies at these uncertain times, how they need to check in on the mental health of their employees, how they need to engage their different departments, how they need to requalify sales, how they need to be focusing on process improvements at this time, or just are reprioritizing different efforts. And so there's a laundry list of things that were identified for our CEOs. If you go back to the CEOs or the leadership and planning real quick. The highlight here is many of our CEOs have not been through a crisis like this before. So, and many are first-time CEOs. They've not sat in this specific seat before, even if they've held a senior leadership role in a prior life. They haven't sat in this seat before. So, all these things that they are suddenly finding themselves wrestling with, it's an area where I think we clearly identified there's an opportunity for those of us in the membership who have sat in this seat through a crisis before to be supportive as they're seeing their roles impacted. Next slide. Just related to financial status, I know this is a lot to digest. The headline and encouraging piece of this is that we're seeing all of our companies revisit their financial projections, their cash flow balance. Most are kind of forecasting revenue, anticipating these reductions coming. They're coming up with contingency plans. And the other items of note, we just wanted to show to share with everyone that this survey was somewhat comprehensive. So we have a pretty good idea of the mixed bag of different situations you might expect our current portfolio companies to be in right now. This is also another area where there's a lot of opportunities to provide support, kind of bring consistency to the responses that our portfolio companies are making around shoring up their financial situations, but also pick out and address very specific situations, unique situations that our portfolio companies are currently in. And then next slide, finally, just how we can help. All right, 80% said North Coast Ventures could be of help at this time. And there's kind of clusters of feedback around. We've already heard about Wiser and some that are in situations where the value propositions have become more acute and where we can rally resources and make introductions and help them with customer connections. I mentioned financials and contingency planning, but this was an area where a number of companies were saying we specifically would like feedback, support in wrestling with some of these decisions we're going to make and what resources to take advantage of. And then just finally, experience sharing and best practice sharing. They all mentioned hungry for experiences of our members who have sat in these seats before, as well as best practices of our portfolio companies as to, you know, the 50-some companies that are right now all wrestling with this. What are they doing? What are they implementing? What can we also execute on? So with that,